order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted to talk to Jason Isaacson once again. Our audience and people who follow us will remember that Jason Isaacson is no newcomer to the global order universe. He's been in conversation with me a couple of times before, always to try and explain the Jewish and indeed the Israeli point of view to many issues around the world. Once again, we're talking to Jason to try and understand the Israeli point of view, even as the war in Gaza stretches on. The ICJ verdict has just come in, and he's best placed to really try and help us understand what the Israeli perspective to all of this is. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Hindol. It's good to be with you again.
Wanted to dive right in and ask Jason, because we're really speaking hours after the ICJ verdict. How did you see this verdict? What do you think is the Israeli and Jewish perspective, so to speak, on the verdict?
First of all, I don't know that verdict is the exact term that we should be using, the term of art. This was a provisional finding to set the stage for further examination by the International Court of Justice, a process that may go on for years as it deliberates on these really outrageous charges that were placed before it by the Republic of South Africa, that Israel was committing genocide. Israel is not committing genocide, was not contemplating genocide. It's offensive to even use that term in relation to what is happening in Gaza, which is terrible on its face regardless, but it's not genocide. There's a very specific thing that genocide is. This is not that. What it is a forceful and in many ways really unfortunate, because of the damage that is also being done, response to a horrific act of terror that was committed by a militia embedded in an urban population in Gaza, that a series of attacks from October 7th to October 8th or 9th that took the lives of more than 1,200 people in Israel. Brutalities that were unimaginable. And if you've ever seen any of the GoPro footage from the Hamas fighters themselves that they proudly sent back to their families to display how brutal they were, the atrocities that they were committing against civilians, Israel had to respond to that. Israel cannot tolerate a terrorist army on its border that can march into the country, kill more than 1,000 people, take 240 hostages and drag them back into Gaza. Israel had to respond in a very forceful way. It has to eliminate this threat. It's targeting Hamas. It's not targeting Palestinians. There are thousands of Hamas fighters and leaders, and as you know, tens of thousands of missiles have been stored there. I think they've probably depleted a large stock of them. But even in the course of this war over the last 3.5, almost 4 months, something like 11,000 or 12,000 missiles have continued to be fired by Hamas into Israeli cities and towns. So this is not a tolerable situation. Israel has to eliminate that threat that is being posed by Hamas, has been for 16 plus years, to the people of Israel, frankly, also to the Palestinians, whose lives have been dictated by this theocratic force called Hamas, supported by Iran, by the way. The question is, how do you eliminate such a threat? It's not a simple process when they have spent the last 16, 17 years digging hundreds of miles, literally hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, using the billions of dollars that have come into them from Qatar and from other agencies, other countries, to embed a whole military infrastructure underneath and around and between the civilians in Gaza. How do you fight such a force? It's easy to say Israel has such a superior military capability. They've got everybody understands the intelligence that the Israeli army and the intelligence services have accumulated over the years, and the reputation, of course, is of the highest order. But a force that's embedded in this way in a civilian population, under hospitals, under mosques, under schools, in homes, this vast network of tunnels is not a simple process. To destroy a tunnel requires being physically there. It requires destroying the entrances to the tunnels, which might be sitting underneath an apartment building. So Israel has warned people when they've carried out raids. They have told people to leave an area and evacuate so that they can attack the Hamas fighters and infrastructure. But people have died in the process, and it's a terrible tragedy. There's no question about that. But Israel's intention is not to kill Palestinians. It's to destroy this military infrastructure and the leaders of Hamas. And they've made a lot of progress over the last 3.5 months. Some 9,000 or 10,000 Hamas fighters have been killed. You don't hear Hamas saying this. You don't see any of the news coverage coming from Gaza that shows pictures of dead Hamas fighters, because if you're a camera operator in Gaza and you show something that Hamas doesn't want you to show, you're not going to last very long, and your family's going to suffer. So you don't see what's actually happening to deplete the capabilities of Hamas, but it's happening. Israel has been very strategic in how it has gone about this, but again, a lot of damage has been done to infrastructure. A huge amount of damage has been done to civilian infrastructure in addition to the military infrastructure of Hamas. And a whole recovery process will have to take place after Hamas is no longer in charge, no longer poses a threat to Palestinians and to Israelis, and to the possibility of peace. Keep in mind, you know this, Hindol, but I have to say this. Hamas is not the champion of a Palestinian people willing to live beside the Jewish people of Israel. It's not in favor of a two-state solution. It's not in favor of a Palestinian state with full rights and passports and flags and a seat at the UN alongside the state of Israel, which has been there since 1948. Not at all. What it wants to do is it wants to kill Jews, and it wants to destroy the state of Israel. That's not going to happen. Israel is not going to let itself be destroyed by this army. So it has to defeat this army, and it has to then work with the Palestinian people to develop a new governing structure in Gaza, work with the international community, work with the Arab states, not stay there forever, but at least stabilize the situation so that it's no longer a military threat, so that a new governing system can be put in place in which the Palestinian people rule themselves, but do not teach their children every day that their greatest aim in life is to become martyrs, to die in support of the Palestinian cause. Their greatest aim in life should be to succeed and to prosper and to live alongside a state that's not going anywhere, which is the state of Israel, which is a friend of India. And I also have to say, because I'm speaking to you, Hindol, as a friend and as if I may say, as a representative, frankly, of a country that has been a friend of the Jewish people for centuries, but that in the course of this terrible crisis that we have been in the Middle East, caused by Hamas and its brutal attacks on October 7th, India has stood almost alone in many forms in demonstrating its understanding of the threat that Israel faces, understanding the necessity of defeating terrorism. India, having suffered terrorism throughout the years, knows profoundly, as other countries should know but don't know, that you cannot live with that kind of a terrorist threat on your border or within your midst. And so recognizes that Israel has to do the job. Obviously, it is in India's interest, it's in the world's interest, it's definitely in the Israelis' interest to do this as quickly and as surgically and with as few casualties of civilians as possible. But it's a war, it's horrific. It will not last beyond the absolute necessity of eliminating the threat that is posed by Hamas leadership and its military capability, and then we'll move to another phase. And I very much hope that the next time you and I are speaking, we'll be at a place where Gaza is being reconstructed and is under new governing authority and is positioned to be part of a formula for bringing peace and finally Palestinian statehood to the people who deserve it have deserved it for so many years, but have been denied that by their leaders.
Maybe, Jason, we'll come to the India question in just a moment, but let me ask you this. From the time this crisis began, from the time Israel was attacked so brutally by Hamas fighters, and there was a worldwide sort of, appalling sort of horror-stricken reaction to what happened in Israel, and those videos that came out, you mentioned the GoPro videos and so on and so forth. From that point to today, There seems to be many people, many people who were at that point also saying that, Israel must do everything it can to eliminate these people. Some of those people are today saying, well, how long will this war really drag on? How many people have really been died? What kind of crisis does the world face because of this? Will this crisis blow out and go into other parts of the Middle East and so on and so forth? Uh, what do you make of this shift, and what would be your response to this shift in opinion?
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned that, Hindol, because yes, in the first hours after the attack, there was this sense of shock, of horror, absolutely, and in many places, not everywhere, I should point out, but in many places, an identification with Israel and empathy for Israel. But that shifted very quickly, frankly, even before the first Israeli airplane flew over Gaza and tried to take out a Hamas target, and even well before the first Israeli troops set foot in Gaza, a shift to say, oh, what Israel is going to do is genocide. Um, Incomprehensible that identification with a country that had been so brutally, so atrociously attacked, inhumanely, barbarically attacked, did not have no one. Why would you not expect it? Why would you not demand that it respond forcefully to such an attack, as this country would, as other countries would when similarly attacked? Um, it's as though people are sympathetic with Jews when they're victims, but not when they are doing something to counter that victimhood, when they're actually defending themselves. As though the region especially is very touchy on the subject of Jewish power and a Jewish state being able to stick up for itself if it means pushing back against an enemy that is forcefully attacking it. And I don't know that I want to get into the whole notion of whether there are anti-Semitic prejudices that are part of this, feeling that it's a tiny minority, and what right does it really have to sort of stick up for itself? Let them sort of stay in their little bunkers, and that's okay. But as soon as they do anything to kind of strike out at those who are attacking them, they can't be right. So it's I don't understand, Hindol. It really is infuriating that more countries, more governments, more civil society organizations, more women's organizations who should have been screaming bloody murder about the sexual assault, the brutal sexual assaults that were taking place against women who were seized by Hamas terrorists and raped and butchered. And you've seen the videos. I've seen some of these videos. It turns your stomach. And why international women's organizations were not crying with the loudest voices against this, appealing to the conscience of the international community. All of this is shocking. In some ways, people who have seen behavior towards Israel over the years when Israel has stood up to defend itself against attacks, maybe you're not so surprised. I am still outraged and shocked at some of the international reaction. I'm hopeful that the messages that I hear privately when I travel across the Arab world, as I have since October 7th, to meet with friends, to meet with people in governments that have opened up to created the possibilities of true interaction, true cooperation, and integration of Israel into that region for a whole range of reasons, for economic reasons, for security reasons, for cultural reasons, or in the case of Morocco, because of the familial relationship between the Kingdom of Morocco and the Jewish people, which goes back thousands of years, 2,000 years. And there are a million Israelis of Morocco, close to a million Israelis of Moroccan descent. So these kinds of relationships, they will stay on track. It has been very clear from talking to friends across the region that the governments recognize Israel has a job that it has to do. They want very much for as few civilian casualties as possible to take place in the course of Israel defeating Hamas, but they understand that Hamas has to be defeated. And frankly, Hamas's sponsors, the Iranians, cannot be allowed to be the winners of this effort to disrupt the possibility of Arab-Israeli peace and even Israeli-Palestinian peace, because to not have Israel as the enemy that they can identify and hold up as a unifying force across the region would be politically damaging to Iran, for instance. And so there are a lot of forces around the region that would very much like this conflict to continue. That is not what the wise leaders with whom I've had the privilege to consult over the last 3.5 months across the region will talk about privately. What they want is this war to end as quickly as possible with Hamas defeated, and to get back on the track that we've been on for the last 3+ years of further integration of Israel into the region, further cooperation, building on the Abraham Accords and the Negev Forum, and frankly, I2U2, in which India will play a very significant role in kind of bonding together the forces of progress in this region and helping the people of the region across borders. That's where the leadership wants to go. We very much support that, and that's why I've been spending as much time as I have, frankly, been on the road, talking with friends and looking for the way forward, which will be a way toward a political path to provide Palestinian rights and political and civil and legal rights and security alongside a secure state of Israel that can defend itself when it has to, and cannot allow this kind of atrocity that took place on October 7th to ever be repeated, but will live in peace, in harmony with its neighbors, and will not teach the next generation of Palestinian children that the highest form of success will be to be killers and martyrs for a Palestinian cause. We're tired of that. It's not possible to continue in that way. We have to find a new path. I'm committed to it, and I know that the Indian government is committed to it as well.
I also want to ask you, Jason, you also saw many other things during this period since the conflict began. One of the things you saw was, or we saw was, Western capitals filling with hundreds and thousands of people, including, cities like London, parts of New York, major cities in Berlin, major cities around the world, Paris filling up with, protesters. And many of these protests, took a, very problematic sort of hues, so should I say, as they went along. What do you think has been the response in Western capitals, including in Western academia, Jason? We saw the cases of the Ivy League colleges and their testimony, and several high-profile academics, including at Harvard, have had to step down after what they said about their opinion about the conflict. What do you make of all this in not in the Middle East, all of this happening in major Western capitals, major Western cities, and indeed at the very heart of elite Western academia?
It's a hugely problematic, challenging set of questions that you've just posed, and ones that I and my colleagues and many people have been wrestling with. And to what extent one can attribute some of the reaction to kind of a lumping Israel together in ways that are historically unfair but popular, as a colonial project, as an exemplar of white privilege, and a country that is oppressing the people of color who, in whose midst they have planted themselves after leaving Europe. And a real misrepresentation. By the way, Israel is not monochromatic. Israel is actually a highly pluralistic society in which a very significant portion of the population, I believe it's a majority of the population, actually are people from the Arab lands, from the Middle East, Jews who come from Iraq and Iran and Morocco and Egypt and Syria, and Yemen and other places. But there is that identification of Israel as sort of a white oppressor that has been fed by this misplaced kind of progressive ideology, I think. And there is kind of an underdog identification, which Israel benefited from when it was seen as a victim and when it was being attacked in decades past, before it gathered the strength and the resolve to actually fight back against the Arab states that were attacking it repeatedly over the decades. So there's now identification with the Palestinians. I also don't discount the fact that there is a Palestinian cause that has legitimacy. Um, it has been badly served by Palestinian leadership, badly exploited and served by Arab states in the region, and frankly, other governments that have taken advantage of this as a way to signify their kind of um, identification with an underprivileged minority of some sort, and have failed to understand the realities of the possibility that Palestinians could have made peace with Israel on multiple occasions. There have been numerous offers to divide the land in as fair a way as possible,
A video of
including
Bill Clinton emerged talking about this and about his own
exactly.
efforts, and I'm sure you saw that video.
Yes, of course. So there have been efforts over the years. Palestinian leadership wanted everything. They wouldn't settle for a compromise. Israelis were prepared to compromise, even on the issue of dividing Jerusalem. There was a period when that was even politically possible in Israel, but the Palestinians rejected that as well. Um, so, so therefore, over the decades, you've had this kind of hardened resistance cause that has been taken up by people who identify with resistance causes and what are seen as progressive causes around the world. And I also have to say that there is an element, and it varies in strength from place to place, of anti-Semitism, of distrusting, despising, having complicated, bizarre, but very powerful conspiracy theories about Jews who, after all, there are 15 or 16 million Jews in the entire world, but there are people who firmly believe that Jews control the world, or they control the West, or they control the media, or they control this or that industry. I've heard that myself in various government offices, even over the years. And regardless of how nonsensical it is, people truly believe in conspiracy theories, as you know. And social media does a lot to help that. And so whether it's fake news, and there's been a lot of fake news coming out of Gaza that's not actually coming out of Gaza, but it's coming out of Syria, or coming out of Iran, or coming out of Russia. People who are trying to show, people who look like they're maybe Israeli soldiers in uniform, and they're actually not Israelis, and it's not being shown, the scene is not actually taking place in Gaza, but it's taking place in some studio someplace or somebody's backyard. And these things are racing around the internet, on TikTok especially, but on Instagram and elsewhere. So that is fueling this. So you have a combination of prejudice and political exploitation and misunderstanding of history and social media influencers and just social media clever videos that many times are fake, contributing to this massive effort to discredit Israel, to delegitimize Israel, to not understand the roots of the conflict, the fact that there have been multiple offers, multiple efforts, very sincere efforts to try to find a way to settle this conflict, but that there's been a Palestinian leadership supported by outside forces as well that will not settle for a compromise. Why? Wants the whole pie. And so when people say too bad about the Jews, no longer exist, and the Jews will have to go someplace else or disappear. That's not going to happen. There has to be a compromise. This land has been settled by Jews and Arabs for millennia. It is possible to share the land, to divide the land. Israel has been, although it is now deeply scarred by what happened on October 7th, and now, as you can understand, has deep mistrust of many of their Palestinian neighbors who celebrated what happened on October 7th. Nevertheless, there's a recognition that there has to be a way to divide, to separate, to find a way to live side by side with Palestinian neighbors. That's something that I'm committed to, my organization, the American Jewish Committee, is committed to, and I know that the government of India is committed to.
I want to ask you, Jason, some people have pointed to the number of deaths, after Israel responded to the horrific attacks that it faced inside Gaza. And two questions here. Many people are asking, fine, so there was a legitimate response, but when will this stop? And what is the end point and what is the end goal? So I would like you to address that first. And the second is, some people have pointed out some statements at the highest levels within Israel, which sort of have turned that old slogan that we all, in fact, objected to, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And, now some people say, well, actually, it's the Israelis who are saying from the rivers to the sea, the entire thing would be Israel. You, in this conversation, also are very clearly saying that the path ahead is for these people to live side by side, for the Israelis and the Palestinian side guided by more enlightened leadership, so to speak, building a sort of prosperous, livelihood for its own people and not remain in perpetual conflict with their Israeli neighbors. But some people today are not so convinced. So if you could take both those questions and tell me what you think.
I'd be happy to, Hindol. Thank you. Israel is a democracy. It's a parliamentary democracy, and it has a coalition government, a coalition that includes some disreputable characters who are extremists, I will say racists, and who do not share the view that I expressed earlier, and that I know you feel as well, that this land has to be shared because it has been shared for centuries, and who want to drive the Palestinians out, or give them some kind of second-class status. Even though, by the way, 21% or so of the Israeli population is Arab, is Palestinian Arab, and have full rights, vote, serve in the Knesset, serve in the judiciary, are diplomats for Israel around the world. Some friends I've known over the years in the Israeli diplomatic corps. And yet there are some extremists in Israel. I think you have extremists here in this country as well, as there are in other democracies in other countries, who have a very different view. Those do not represent the Israeli public, and they do not represent the Israeli government. You asked also how long this is going to last. There are phases in this war, as there are phases in other wars. Israel is getting a lot of advice from its friends, including the United States, of course. Famously, you read the news, you know what is happening. A lot of consultations with the ministry, the Secretary of Defense, and other national security officials and intelligence officials, and Israel is getting advice from others as well. And Israel has its own timetable and its own strategic planning of how to prosecute this war. And it's in Israel's interest to not drag this on any longer than necessary. I will tell you that in my first visit after October 7th, which was about 4 weeks after October 7th, I heard a lot of absolutist talk about the need to destroy every missile, the need to destroy every Hamas leader and fighter. As this has ground on, it has been made clear, as would happen in any war, that a different set of objectives, more pragmatic, more realistic, more achievable, have to be put forward. And so what I heard when I was just there in the last few days was a sense that what is necessary is to make sure that Hamas no longer governs Gaza, that Hamas no longer poses a military threat to the safety and security of Israel, so that frankly, tens of thousands of Israelis who have had to leave their homes, many of their homes have been destroyed in southern Israel by Hamas fighters and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters who streamed over the fence. But until they can't come back, until they will not come back and rebuild their homes. It would make no sense until that threat has been vastly degraded, eliminated. That doesn't mean killing every Hamas fighter. It doesn't mean finding every missile, because everyone understands that there is embedded in that population still a resentment and decades of training, or 16 years of training for this kind of effort. It's not going to be possible to eliminate that ideology and, frankly, every adherent to that ideology. But as with ISIS, as with Al Qaeda, it is possible to eliminate enough and to keep pressing so that it is no longer posed. It's a tolerable threat relative to what is possible in that region, and how long that will take. It could be many months before Israel feels secure enough to completely leave Gaza, but not many months before the intense phase of the operation that they've been pursuing since the middle of October is able to be wound down. And we're already seeing that. Casualties on a daily basis are significantly lower than they were in the first weeks of this war. Everyone understands humanitarian aid has to flow in. Hamas, by the way, is stealing a lot of that humanitarian aid and storing it in their tunnels. That's a problem, and there are UN agencies that aren't helping very much solve that problem, but that's a whole other issue. Nevertheless, humanitarian aid has to continue to flow in. Corridors have to be maintained so that Palestinians can find safety, can come back to their homes once the military threat has been cleared from areas, and that's starting to happen. But it's a process that will take place over the course of the next weeks, maybe months, until it is possible to envision a rebuilding effort that really gets underway, and that I know Israel is committed to, and I know that there are countries in the region, again, coupled with a political path forward, that are willing to play a role in rebuilding Gaza and reestablishing a sane, responsible, effective governing authority over the Palestinian people.
Three last questions, Jason, and the first one is taking off from what you just said. What kind of administration do you envisage at the end of this conflict? Once Israel, in a sense, pulls out, and where once it feels credibly that the Hamas threat from Gaza has been eliminated and pulls out. What kind of administration do you see being built there? What kind of role would the Israel play in helping build that administration? And indeed, what kind of role, since you represent the American Jewish Committee, what kind of role do you see America play in building that new administration?
Well, thank you. I would say that there are a number of formulas that are being kicked around these days, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Obviously, the U.S. administration has been very much a part of that. Multiple visits, as you know, by the Secretary of State, by the National Security Advisor, by Pentagon officials, intelligence officials, and lower level folks as well, from the White House to the State Department, other agencies of the U.S. government. And my own organization has been talking to a lot of people in the region as well. So it is clear that to provide some kind of assurance of security, of the elimination of the Hamas threat, Israel will continue to play a security role, will have a security role for the, let's say, immediate future, let's say the indefinite future, because it will still be some time while pockets of Hamas fighters are being tracked down, while rockets and missiles are still being launched. But I don't expect that to go on for a long term, but it'll take some time to eliminate that. A much more surgical, much more limited, much more precise operation. So Israel will continue to have a security role, but not a governing role. It has been made very clear, even though you hear, as I said, some radical voices coming from within the Israeli political circles of reestablishing settlements in Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, or a permanent military installation in the Gaza Strip. That's not in Israel's policy. It's not in Israel's long-term interest to do that. So a midterm period of security necessity, but not a long-term reestablishment of an Israeli presence. And so therefore, who does govern Gaza? It will be Palestinians who govern Gaza. I believe that it'll be necessary, it'll be useful if there could be some sort of an agreement, a cooperation with Arab states that very much want a stable Gaza, very much want to help the Palestinian people move into a phase where they govern themselves, where they are no longer being governed by a dictatorial, theocratic force, military force called Hamas with support from Iran. And also that have countries in the region that have undergone their own transitions over the years to promote tolerance, to promote, to defeat extremism, which of course has, boiled in that region for years and has done great damage to that region. And wise leaders recognize the mistakes that have been made in the past and have moved with incredible force and wisdom to correct that course, so that you have massive curriculum changes that have taken place, massive celebration of tolerance, and I've visited many times, and perhaps you have as well, Hindol, the Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi, which has a mosque alongside a church alongside a synagogue built by the government of Abu Dhabi, of the United Arab Emirates. There is a new spirit in that region that also must become the spirit of Gaza, must become the spirit of the Palestinian people, of people living together, not celebrating martyrdom, but celebrating, my daughter is a scholar, not my son is a shaheed. And this, we have to turn in that direction. And frankly, it's the countries in the region that have made that turn that have to be part of that process as well, in cooperation with the United States, in cooperation with Israel, which will have a security function. And I believe that if that is done successfully, there's no reason why we can't see that leading to a future Palestinian state with the West Bank and Gaza under a common administration alongside the state of Israel, without posing security threats to Israel, integrated in an economic way as well, and as part of that region. But we have a long way to go to get to that, but we have to start, and there are friendly countries, wise leaders across the region who understand that's the direction that we need to be going. And my organization, AJC, is deeply committed to that process as well. We'll continue to work with these governments and with our friends in the Israeli government and Israeli society to make that the reality. And frankly, India's cooperation in all of this and its support for that kind of progress, which will also benefit Israel, which will also benefit India, the Indian people, as we've seen the development of the relationship between India and Israel in so many sectors, but also India's very close cooperation with countries in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world. The possibilities are endless. We have to start, and I know that there are many friendly forces across the region who can defeat these forces of extremism and hate.
Alluded many times in this conversation, Jason, to support that Hamas received from Iran. Many people believe and are really frightened of the fact that this conflict, there's a chance that this conflict, in a sense, will spill over. Other countries in the region will get involved. There would be a Hezbollah angle to this conflict. It would drag in Iran, overtly. Perhaps Iran is obviously, in some senses, many people believe is engaged covertly, but there will be a larger spillover of this conflict. Tell us what you think about that.
I'm concerned about the possibility of a broader war, and of course, we've seen what has been happening off the coast of Yemen, the attacks on shipping by the Houthis, who are an instrument of Iran, are trained and funded and armed by Iran, and have been taking shots and also at shipping that comes from India. And I understand what I've been told is that 1 out of every 5 merchant seamen is an Indian. So Indians are very much in the crosshairs as well because of the actions by the Houthis supported by Iran, who are keeping the flames, simmering across. Flames don't simmer. Keeping the flames, high across the region, not necessarily pressing Hezbollah to open fire on Israel in a massive way. There have been hundreds of rockets that have been fired by and rocket-propelled grenades and other anti-tank munitions and other firing across the border from Hezbollah into Israel that's actually killed Israelis. It's been horrendous what's been happening, but not a massive barrage of missile firing as Hezbollah would be capable of, because Iran is not pushing Hezbollah, at least at this point, to get into the war in a big way. But Iran is very much trying to keep fires going on all of Israel's borders and do whatever it can to prevent the possibility of Israeli-Palestinian peace going forward and Arab-Israeli peace going forward. And I have heard from leaders across the region their complete recognition of that, understanding that it is not in Iran's interest to see peace. Iran very much wants to keep conflict alive because it is a unifying force that Iran can capitalize on with its proxies in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iraq and elsewhere in the region, and distracting its own people that they have to oppose Israel because Israel poses a threat to Iran is a way to distract people from the oppressive nature of the Iranian regime itself domestically, and its brutality against its own people. So Iran does not want to see a settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, does not want to see a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and is doing everything it possibly can to prevent that from happening. We mustn't allow that to win. We must allow the people who want peace, who want cooperation, who want integration, who want prosperity to be the victors of all of this. And that's why it's important to eliminate this Hamas threat, to push back against Iran's other incursions in the region and aggression in the region. Frankly, also the nuclear program, which is a whole other subject. Perhaps we'll talk about it at greater length in our next conversation. But I don't think the people of Iran want this, but that's what the leadership of Iran has been stoking. I very much hope that we'll get past this, build a more peaceful, stable region, and that Iran will eventually be a part of that rather than, an opponent of that and an obstacle to that kind of peace.
You said that we'll probably discuss about the nuclear threat in a different conversation, but I cannot but ask you, because there are serious concerns about that, about the threat posed, a nuclear threat that is posed by this conflict spilling across the region, and what kind of threat perception you have about the acquisition of nuclear weapons by certain countries and the deployment of such weapons.
I mean, the country that I'm worried about is Iran, the country that has an active uranium enrichment program that has gone well beyond the limits that were established under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015. The country that in the past had a weaponization program that was revealed by the archives that, frankly, Israeli intelligence was able to seize and release. If Iran were to pursue weaponization again, given the highly enriched uranium that they have been stockpiling, which is enough to fuel several nuclear warheads, it would pose a catastrophic threat, a very significant threat to safety and stability of this region. So it must not be allowed to move forward. It is not possible to imagine politically today resolving that threat through the negotiations with Iran, which Iran has made very difficult. There were efforts during the first 2 years of the Biden administration, 2.5 years of the Biden administration, to try to bring Iran back into compliance, to bring the United States back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Those negotiations did not succeed. And Iran has just continued to defy the International Atomic Energy Agency, their own commitments, as well as advancing their ballistic missile program in ways that are really threatening to peace and stability across the region. I'm hoping that making progress on the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian front will allow for kind of a limitation on the ability of Iran to exploit that for their own purposes. But frankly, the region has to get more serious about confronting Iran, and my own government has to be more serious about confronting Iran. And firing the occasional missile by a proxy to bases across the region, including bases where American servicemen and contractors are, is not acceptable. And if a bully acts like that in the neighborhood, something has to be done in a more forceful way to demonstrate to that bully that that's not tolerable. The United States has taken more serious action in the last few weeks. You've seen some missile strikes and, of course, strikes on the Houthi installations that have been sending missiles at various ships in the region. And they've also, of course, engineered the boarding of certain vessels. There needs to be more of that. There needs to be a more forceful confrontation of this bully in the region who has to learn that that kind of behavior is not acceptable. And the nuclear program has to be wound down. Again, a very complicated process. The IAEA could take firmer action with greater international support. But it's in no one's interest to see the Iranian nuclear program advanced. No one other than the dictators who run Iran, the Iranian regime today. I don't think it's in the interest of the Iranian people. It's not in the interest of any of Iran's neighbors to see the Iranian nuclear program continue to make progress.
Last question, Jason. You began this conversation talking about, a fruitful meeting that you had earlier with Minister Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister of India, and also talking about India's steadfast commitment to supporting and understanding Israel's point of view in this terrible conflict in Gaza, and also the attack and security concerns that Israel faces. Talk to us a little bit about that relationship, the India-Israel relationship, especially in the light of what has happened in the conflict and the support therein.
Thank you, Hindol. You'll understand, it would not be wise for me or polite for me to talk in specific terms about the conversation that I had with Minister Jaishankar, whom I greatly admire, and who has been very gracious in receiving me and my colleagues over the years. AJC is a strong supporter of the U.S.-India relationship. We have been for many years, and we've been on the front lines of efforts to strengthen that relationship, including going back many years to the George W. Bush administration supporting the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which was a landmark in advancing the strategic partnership between the United States and India. I also know that as a sister democracy and as a country that has known terror and has fought against terror and misunderstanding and prejudice, there is a lot that binds India and Israel, in addition to enormous economic complementarities that can be capitalized on, and that smart business people have figured out ways to do that. And I know that more of that is coming. So I'm very excited about the possibilities that exist in the U.S.-India relationship and the possibilities that exist in the Indian-Israeli relationship, which has been flowering since it was launched in a very official way in January of 1992. And I remember visiting India not long after that and hearing some of the hopes that people were expressing about the possibilities that would exist in advancing the India-Israel relationship, and then coming back year after year and meeting with friends of the Indian government and civil society, and of course Israeli friends, some of whom moved here to work on this relationship, and seeing the enormous gains that have been made and the possibilities that exist. So when I meet with the Honorable Minister of External Affairs, we talk about a range of issues, but I never leave without expressing my gratitude, my appreciation for the advances that have been made in both of these sectors, the U.S.-India relationship and the India-Israel relationship. And I also always say in every meeting, I talk about the important role that the Indian American community has played in this. In partnership with my organization, I've been privileged to travel to India in the past with leaders of the Indian American community. They are our partners in a whole range of issues in the United States as well. So this natural symbiotic relationship between our peoples is something that AJC celebrates and does whatever we can to advance.
Jason Isaacson, thanks very much once again for talking to Global Order and taking me through in great detail about the current situation in the conflict in Gaza and wider issues relating to regional peace and prosperity, but also other issues like India-Israel-America relationship and other contexts like that. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Hindol. Always good to be with you.